go. Caroline uses curiosity and compassion to help clients explore their internal landscapes and attend to their feelings and desires. Caroline believes that by exploring your rich inner world in a safe space, you can expand your awareness of yourself, learn to regulate your emotions, build internal trust, and experience more agency in your life. Prior to counseling, Caroline worked as a consultant in the ed tech space and also worked in the nonprofit field as a program director for an arts education initiative. Caroline and her husband, Ben Cleveland, were recently married in the fall of 2022. Congratulations, and are enjoying newly married life as longtime residents of Austin. Caroline loves to hike in the Greenbelt. Which Greenbelt, by the way?
Well, we like to go in Westlake to the Hill of Life, and also in, all over.
Wonderful. Excellent. And enjoys playing tennis with her husband. Caroline is a member of the Episcopal Church of the Good Shepherd. We're not going to try to steal her. And previously was a mentor with Explore Austin for 6 years. Caroline, welcome.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity, and it's been really nice to get to know Matt a bit and learn about your community and your church. Matt, would you be able to enable screen sharing?
Yes, ma'am.
It should just be a setting. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Just one moment. Sorry, while I'll share this. Oh, shoot. I have to quit. Okay, let me do one more thing. Apologies.
No worries.
One.
Didn't tell you.
Okay, I'm gonna try one more time.
There you go.
There we go. Can everyone see that all right? Great. And it's not that important, but can everyone see the screen? I just put on a few slides to kind of talk through this part 4. Great. Well, welcome everyone. And Matt, thank you so much for that introduction. And that I thought that this as Matt spoke about, this kind of chapter, this part 4, focuses on memory and what we remember, how we remember, and different types of memory. As Matt mentioned, the kind of normal or narrative memory, which incorporates storytelling, and then what happens when there's trauma and how that impacts our memory. So I'll be talking through that, and I'm kind of doing that at a very kind of simple level. And I know at the end we'll welcome conversation, and I look forward to that discussion. Any discussion of trauma, and I know Matt just mentioned that, but I just want to reiterate that if there's anything that is overstimulating or is triggering, I just really want to encourage everyone to take care of themselves, to step away, and to really be good for themselves. And we always try to kind of have a space that's safe enough, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to have some kind of reaction to it. So just really want to name that as we enter into this conversation. And I thought that we could start with just kind of a brief body scan. This is something that I do with my clients in my work. And I also wanted to share, I shared this with Matt, but I'll be pulling a lot in this conversation from this book. It's called The Brain and the Spirit. And it's by Dr. Jenna St. David. She's the director of the program at Seminary of the Southwest and was one of my professors. She's a phenomenal teacher, but basically this book kind of looks at kind of Christ's neurobiology and what was happening in the mind of Christ, in Christ and his action through kind of a psychological and inner biological lens. So I really want to credit her with, I'm greatly pulling from a lot of her ideas, as well as Bessel van der Kolk's. But yeah, so if everyone, I know most people are seated, but if you just want to feel a bit more comfortable in your chair, if that means, kind of leaning back or just feeling the weight of yourself in the chair, feeling your feet on the floor. I know some of us have just eaten. We've all just finished the day. But if it feels safe, you're welcome to close your eyes or even just lower your eyes. And I like to start with just a few deep breaths, just kind of in through your nose, out through your mouth. And I'm just inviting you all to shift our attention away from the busyness of our day, away from problem solving, away from attending to all of what we have to do every day. And just to begin to notice what it's like to be you in this moment, in your body, in your seat. So as you place awareness on your breath, many consider this a way to become aware of the spirit within. And just start to become aware of the spirit within. And when you're ready, you can say or think to God, I'm listening. And with some gentle curiosity, if that's possible, just begin to notice any sensations, any thoughts, emotions, areas of congestion in your body, areas of tension. These are trailheads. They're information that our body is giving us. And we're just taking this moment to just pay a bit more attention to them, to attune to them. And notice what that's like for you. But also let them know that you're here, present with them, as is this community. And if you become distracted, just simply return to your breath and to the spirit. And you can say to God once again, I'm listening. And when that scan feels complete, just bring your attention slowly back into this space that we're sharing together. Yeah, and I'm just curious, and I don't know if this works in this format, but if anyone would want to share what that was like for them, what they noticed in that brief scan. What was that?
Comfortable.
Comfortable. Great. Thank you for sharing. Did someone say something else? No. Okay. Yeah, that can just be a way for us to tune into ourselves, to tune in, It's that art of paying attention to us, of what messages our body is receiving. And that's part of, some of the work that we'll be talking about today. So as Matt mentioned, many of us carry unprocessed memories from our lives, from childhood, and we don't necessarily realize how these experiences impact your present day life. And these potentially traumatic, and we talk about trauma, I don't know if this has been mentioned before, but there's kind of what we call like big T trauma, and then there's little t trauma, which we all experience. And I'm sure you've talked about this, but trauma, you can kind of think of it as an unhealed wound. So in that way, these kind of traumatic memories from the past, they drive and determine unconscious responses to the present when they're not processed in the presence of kind of support and care. Trauma causes us to have a crisis of faith or doubt or safety of our well-being in one of four areas: with ourselves, with others, with the world, or with God. And so if the kind of trauma or the unhealed wound, if you weren't properly resourced, and we'll talk about this a bit more, or the people around you weren't able to resource you, that's what kind of causes that experience of a traumatic kind of memory to develop. And so it causes a disjointed or incoherent story. And that story begins to be told over and over. And so it's an unresolved story. And even though the immediate danger is over, what we consider to be that traumatic stressor, your amygdala, which is the brainstem, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, it's still responding, like the threat is still going. So people can really not be aware. They can think, this is just who I am. This is how I respond. I'm anxious. I'm someone on high alert. But actually, it's your brain kind of responding to a threat response, and in some ways misperceiving the threat response. In some cases, it might be accurately perceiving that the threat is still continuing, but a lot of times the actual traumatic danger has passed. So Matt mentioned this idea of normal memory, and normal memory being narrative. It's a memory, a story. It has a beginning, middle, and an end. And we'll look at an example of that in a minute. So these stories are adaptive. They can be modified. It's also social. So we tell these stories for a purpose. And what it also means, and what Bessel van der Kolk explores, and our understanding of kind of the brain and neurobiology, is that both our left and our right brain, kind of our rational language center, and then our emotion centers, they collaborate to produce an integrated response, which includes both thinking and feeling. And we're able to construct a cohesive and coherent autobiographical narrative, which is a really strong indicator for resilience, that we can tell this story in that way. But what happens with a traumatic memory is that when the trauma happens and the person is not resourced kind of internally and doesn't have that support around them, our memory becomes fragmented. So the imprints, and this is from the book, the imprints of the traumatic experience are not organized in that normal memory way, that coherent logical narrative, but it's in a fragmented sensory and emotional traces. So this looks like involuntary flashbacks, images, sounds, and physical sensations, and a lack of verbal memory. So this is that intensity. You can feel it in your body. You don't know why it's happening, why you're having this level of response. So you can't leave these memories in the past. And that's what Bessel van der Kolk says, and Matt mentioned, you disassociate from them. You kind of leave your body and you create a dual memory system. And this disassociation, is a way to protect yourself. And so Bessel van der Kolk talks about clients or people with traumatic memories being able to regain them in bits and pieces, but they're not kind of experiencing it with that, this thing happened, and then someone helped me, and then I felt better. That's not how they're experiencing it. And so I work as a therapist, and part of that work is working with a client with a traumatic experience, is to help clients kind of tolerate those sensations, those emotions, those reactions that they experience without necessarily being kind of overtaken by them. And I know next time will be about kind of the path forward and how to work with trauma. So I'm sure that will be addressed, but it's really important to acknowledge that trauma is not, the fault of the person that it's happened to. It's not caused by a defect, and no one deserves this to happen to them. It's characterized by there being a lot of arousal in our brain because our brain is perceiving this threat. Bessel van der Kolk talks about kind of things that we can remember really well, it has that arousal, like maybe an insult or an injury, because the adrenaline we're secreting to kind of defend against the threat makes our mind very alert. But then in a situation where it's that big trauma, it overwhelms our mind's ability. We don't feel supported. We don't have the internal resources to handle it. And so that's when the frontal part of our brain shuts down. And so our frontal brain, the frontal lobe, is responsible for executive function. And so that's why we can't put language to what's happening. And we're kind of focused in that limbic area, the emotional system of the brain. And Bessel van der Kolk talks about how our mind works according to kind of schemas or understandings that we have about our life and our world. And so if anything falls outside of that experience, it's really going to capture our attention in that way. And then, one complexity of traumatic memory is that there's a delayed recall. Bessel van der Kolk talks about his work as an expert witness with the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal, and really kind of educating our culture, our judicial system, our understanding, as Matt mentioned, with war veterans, about that it's not necessarily you're going to immediately recall these things. And an unresolved, and I'll skip on. I wanted to show this hand model of the brain. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but Dr. Dan Siegel, who's a psychiatrist, he really studies kind of the relational nature of the brain, meaning our ability to kind of co-regulate, to be in relationship, to either soothe each other or to really help each other get dysregulated. He calls it the hand model of the brain, and his expression is flipping your lid, which looks like that. And that means that your prefrontal cortex, it goes offline. So you're not able to have that higher level thinking, that executive functioning. It can be helpful to know. I mean, a lot of people will use it with their children, but it can be helpful to know in ourselves to understand. And so that's what's happening. The brainstem, the amygdala, it's kind of really responding to the threat. And generally it's responding to a prior threat that's not even in the present moment, but there's kind of similar stimuli that reminds the brain of that prior experience that kind of hasn't been healed yet. Had anyone, I'm going to see if I can go back to see people's faces. Had anyone heard of that before, the hand model of the brain or flipping your lid? No. It can be even just like a helpful, like, oh, I flipped my lid. Just a moment of awareness kind of brings us back.
Our speaker last week did talk about that. Props to Richard Yu.
Nice. Sorry. Well, sorry to repeat. I just thought it was helpful to talk about kind of memory and what's happening in our brain.
Caroline, I wasn't here last week, so I really appreciated it. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate the support. Yeah. So let's look at an unresolved narrative. So an unresolved narrative that's kind of still with the traumatic memory is this horrible thing happened to me, or I did something horrible and I didn't know what to do and no one supported me with it. So there's not that kind of coherent sense of beginning, middle, and end with a conclusion. Whereas, and let me say, and so that's because the stress was just simply too high and our system was overwhelmed and we didn't have the support kind of internally or externally to help us cope. And so when the brain codes a memory as unresolved, that hopeful ending is missing. But this is what a resolved narrative looks like. This horrible thing happened, or I did something horrible, but I learned what to do and others supported me through it. This is also what we call post-traumatic growth. You can tell a meaningful and coherent story, like Matt was saying about the crucifixion and the resurrection, that there's meaning, that there's purpose. And what's happening when our brain is able to tell this resolved narrative, it updates the memory network of the event in our brain with the networks in our brain that hold awareness of, I am no longer alone and I learned what to do. So this post-traumatic growth is that we can tell this story, and it's bringing together kind of the language and the emotion so that it's not isolated in one side of the brain. And the brain is aware that our immediate danger is in the past, not the present. And this happens when the conditions are safe enough to engage these kind of upper parts of our brain. So I was curious and wanted to just try and experiment. If everyone wanted to think of, and I'm thinking of, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most traumatic thing, thinking of a 1, kind of a little T trauma. We all have them. We all have unhealed wounds. So a level 1 on the lower end of the 1 to 10 scale. Can you think of something? I don't know if you just want to think about it, if you have a pen to write it down, but just coming up with something in the resolved narrative category. So this thing happened that was bad, but I learned what to do and others supported me through it. If you could just give like 1 to 2 minutes to consider that for yourself. And I don't want anyone to share if they're not wanting to, or that doesn't feel comfortable or safe, but just would be curious if anything came to mind for anyone that they felt that they wanted to share with the group. Would love to hear from someone.
Caroline, our sound system is not the best, so
Okay,
bear with us.
great.
So I have one that relates to the church.
Yeah.
Back many years ago, I met a man and we were planning a wedding. I was raised Roman Catholic, and we learned that we weren't going to be able to be married in the Roman Catholic Church because he was divorced. And so in the middle of my busy workday, he calls and I tell him the news. He said, "That's just no problem." He said, "We could get married in the Southern Baptist Church." I went, oh my gosh. I mean, I started to cry and instantly said, "That's not possible at all." So he had already converted to Episcopalianism. And so we met with the Episcopal church, priest who was amazing. He relieved my mind, though
Yeah.
he didn't promise anything until the bishop could give his blessing. And we got it on Christmas Eve. It was our gift. So that's that wasn't a number one. The trauma was 3 or 4 for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And what's your name? Oh,
Sandra.
Sandra, thank you so much for sharing that story. That's a really beautiful example, and being resourced with your spouse and by the priest as well, the kind of community, really, all of you coming together. Yeah. And if anyone else wants to share, no one has to, but I just want to allow that opportunity if anyone. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Holly. How are you?
Well,
In 1981, in Austin, since you're from Austin, you remember the big flood that happened on Shoal Creek. And I was living in Corpus Christi, and my mother lives on Shoal Creek. And I get a phone call at 10 o'clock at night. And it's my sister who lives here in Austin at the time. And she goes, "Do you know anybody that lives in our old neighborhood that you can call at 10 o'clock at night and go check on mom?" I was like, "Yeah, Mr. Giddens, who's probably 80 years old also, but yeah." So he goes down there. I call him. He goes, "Yeah, I'll walk down there. It's about 2 blocks." He comes back and he calls me and he goes, "Holly, I can't get across the street. It's like 14 feet up." And I go, "Oh." So I start calling and finally get someone that would do a rescue. And I come up the next day flying on, I don't know, Texas and TI or whatever it was called. And I get here and everybody that knew my mother still lived there had showed up like at 8 o'clock in the morning and just started ripping up carpet, knocking out walls. And it was just fantastic. And it was a faith in the community. And
How do
making
you-
it okay.
That's really beautiful. How do you feel right now sharing that story?
It makes me sad sometimes
Yeah.
because it was scary.
very scary. Yeah. And then that community really wrapped around. all
Right,
of-
right. And it was great. And it was great because everything ended up being okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much
Yeah.
for your vulnerability
bet.
and sharing that story. I really appreciate it.
We are a talkative bunch.
I love it.
And
It's so wonderful. I really appreciate y'all sharing so much. It can be helpful, this can be a helpful framework to think, even to kind of check in with yourself if you're experiencing something, if you're processing something, if you're able to check in with how am I talking about this? How am I telling this story? How am I experiencing it? And if it's like that, this thing happened, I was able to get support, or people came and supported me and we're working on it. And that doesn't mean it's not messy or complex, but if we're really just kind of stuck back there, it can be like, okay, I need some more support around this. I need, my brain's kind of perceiving this as if it were still happening, which just means that there's an opportunity for additional support, for additional exploration. I was going to share, so the kind of the conditions that our brain needs for wellness, as I've mentioned, to be resourced enough and supported enough. And I think that's a beautiful thing in the context of church, of our faith, that we have needs, and we need to acknowledge them and be honest about them. And we need to, explore them and have them met. And there's some needs that we can meet on our own, some needs that are met in relationships and community by God. So something to think about there. And so when I've been speaking about healing, we're really, in this context with kind of trauma, we're speaking about a process that is updating the brain. And as I mentioned, it's telling the brain the felt experience of, I'm no longer alone and I learned what to do. And Matt, you mentioned kind of disintegration, disassociation, fragmentation, and I'll stop talking in a minute just after this, but, in some ways, and Bessel van der Kolk talks about this, especially with children in highly traumatic, horrible events, this disassociation, this fragmentation. And in a way, it's a way of the brain kind of protecting you in the moment from that, or not in the moment, but kind of afterwards, to remove you from those terrible experiences. And so part of the work of therapy and what we call kind of a safe enough space with a good enough other, as the therapist. That's what we try to be. We try to hold space for people. We try to regulate our nervous system, which again, another shout out for this book, The Brain and the Spirit. Jenna talks about how Jesus's nervous system, you know, he might have been angry, but there was regulation. He could handle it. And so we're kind of opening space to allow this activity, this stimulation, this pain, and to say, and we're here with you now, and it's a very different experience. And that it's a beautiful process of integration and of claiming that and of managing the pain in a tolerable way, but again, with that kind of hopeful, that ending of being supported. And I wanted to end with this quote from Dan Siegel, as I mentioned, that psychiatrist who really studies kind of the relational nature of the brain, that how we're always co-regulating, which just means managing. So if I came in here and was really upset and yelling at everyone, that might amp you up a little bit. And so we have this ability to impact each other in relationship. And so this is talking about integration. So this process of kind of bringing this, our fragmented selves, our parts that get traumatized, that get hurt, and with this deeper part of ourselves within community, with the good enough other, we're able to do this work of integration. And so this quote is, "Love is ultimately integration made visible, emerging as kindness and compassion. Compassion and kindness arise when we free the mind from impediments to these innate states of integration in our lives. This is how love and care would naturally arise with presence. From this integrative source of being open, connected to our inner lives and our interconnections with one another and with the planet we all share. This is the freedom therapeutic healing change can encourage, moving beyond the chaos and rigidity of suffering to the integrative synergy of thriving in a life filled with potential, freedom, and connection." And that really reminds me of how interrelated we all are, and the support that we need, the role of community, of connection, of relationship, and the role of the church in that. So yeah, that's what I have to share, but I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts, comments, questions, feedback, however you want to share. Thank you. And let me stop sharing.
You say resolve the narrative, you're like saying that's gospel. It's good news.
I'm going to repeat.
Great.
Good. So what Pete said was, when you talk about the narrative being resolved, that kind of sounds like the gospel, that the good news. That's what Pete said.
Yeah, that I love that connection. Absolutely. And that framing things in perspective, and in that sense of purpose and meaning. What do other people think about that? That resonance with the gospel.
Fascinating question.
Something to chew on. Yeah.
To me, like I love it. I love that Pete said that. I high five, unmitigated high five. To me, resurrection makes a lot of, I mean, there's always a danger of being trite or can't think of the right word right now, but like saying, "Oh, God's gonna fix it all." You know what I mean? There's always that danger.
Yeah.
And we don't have to, like, that's a false danger. But the resurrection is real. And it comes after the trauma. And man, thanks be to God. Mikhail, would you like me to translate or would you like to come up here? Either way is fine with me.
Let me see if you can translate.
Great.
I think one of the interesting things about the resurrection is that in the Gospels, the resurrection doesn't just happen.
All right, I think that one of the interesting things that happens in the gospel stories is that the resurrection doesn't just happen,
It evolves.
it
Yeah.
evolves.
Everybody's at a different stage in that understanding.
And everyone's at a different stage of that understanding.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering if that's similar in therapy. In other words, when someone is trying to deal with
Mhm.
trauma, is there this, it's not just a eureka moment.
No,
but it's-
yeah.
So did you hear all that, Caroline, or can I sort of?
Yeah,
Make it
I
clear
think
to
I
me.
heard most of it, but maybe just the last
Good.
part, just to make sure.
So she's wondering, Mikkel's wondering if it's the same in therapy
Yeah,
and in psychological healing, that it's an ongoing process.
Mhm.
It's not a once
yeah,
for all. Yeah,
yeah, it's a beautiful question
and
and
different for different people.
different for different people, definitely. And also, there's a lot of understanding now and kind of trauma. And Matt, you kind of alluded to this, like if something really, traumatic happens to us, say at the age of 12, basically what happens kind of in our brain is that we almost get like frozen in time at 12 for a part of ourselves, not our full identity. But then it's almost like as an adult, you have like a 12-year-old kind of running that aspect of your life. And so the process, and I would say it's a process, it's kind of updating, what I would say with your true self, that the spirit within you, so that part of you that's been wounded, that's been hurt, can receive that healing of that wise part of you, if it's, God, the spirit, that has not been hurt, that's not damaged, kind of deep within each of us, the spirit. And so that process of updating, and like you said, that kind of evolution of like, actually the healing is possible. And I like to think of healing as kind of cloves of garlic. The onion is often used in therapy, but it's almost like you kind of remove one clove of garlic and there's still more, but you're kind of getting to this place of healing and maybe less reactivity. But I absolutely, even kind of when you said different people in the gospel having different reactions, that can happen kind of collectively. People are in different places of healing. If there's been kind of a collective trauma, we've seen that in our culture recently. People have very different reactions, responses, all of that to it, even if there was kind of a shared experience.
Shared experience. Isn't it interesting that there's 4 gospels, not just one, 4 radically different,
So true.
and there's more there's more that didn't make the cut. Yeah, and there's a retrospectivity about how there is no event without interpretation.
Yeah.
And that, I can't believe I'm about to say this, but that's what my book is about. Y'all remember on the retreat, I didn't want to talk about my book, but Kathleen made me. I'm kind of embarrassed about it, but so if we think about the event of the resurrection, that event necessarily goes along with the interpretations of those events. In fact, one of my definitions for fundamentalism is forgetting that the events in the scriptures have to be interpreted. Right? And yeah, it's an ongoing process, and there's multiple perspectives, and there's 4 gospels. Freud actually had a word, Nachträglichkeit, which means looking back upon something. There's a retrospectivity. We make sense of something through memory, through interpretation, and through doing that in community.
Yeah.
And I'm going to stop talking now.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And that reminds me, Bessel van der Kolk talks about something in this, about basically In trauma, kind of the memory is unchanged. And part of the disassociation is it hasn't come out. It hasn't received any air, any support. And in thinking about kind of therapy or healing in community, those others being there to fully resource you and kind of give you that support so that that memory can be witnessed to, can be processed, can be shown the love and care that wasn't received in that moment, at the moment of harm.
Alice.
So I'm thinking in terms of,
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
In trauma and in therapy, that we get to tell this story every year. We get to visit the Easter story every year. And so much like therapy, if you've got trauma, you've got several opportunities to tell your story.
Yeah.
And we get to think about it and heal as best we can.
That's such a beautiful
Amen.
thought. And absolutely that kind of needing to revisit it, needing to pay attention, and doing that in community. And the garlic clove, each year we're attending to one of those cloves.
Very cool.
curious, if in therapy, with someone who's been traumatized, is it usual for somebody to go back and forth?
Okay, hang on. So Denise is asking.
Yeah.
In therapy, is it usual or typical or normal for someone to go back and forth, for the person who's experienced trauma to go back and forth as far as their healing goes?
Yeah. And back and forth meaning in terms of progress or yeah. Now there are some really great, and I think next week y'all will explore some really well-researched, kind of scientifically based trauma healing modalities, because used to, as P talks about the kind of talking cure, it's not just talking about it. It's talking about it in a specific way, in a resonant way, kind of that's activating these areas of the brain in community. But there are some ways where you can really kind of heal that exiled pain. And we're kind of resourcing that part of your brain and ways that it hadn't been. And that really is truly unburdening, releasing, letting go of that exiled pain. There's some beautiful ways to do that. Internal family systems is one. I know he'll talk about EMDR as another one, movement, yoga, these kinds of things. But I think there always is in our life of these things that are really kind of seminal events for us. They're always going to be touchstones. So things can get kind of sensitive, it's like a nerve, but you can kind of still have pretty vast improvement. But I think in life, we always have these senses of one step forward, two steps back, while things you can be in a much better place with some of these core traumatic things, that there really is that hope is possible.
Hey, Caroline, we had one question, I think. In ENTR?
Yes. Or what is that? Is that the?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's EMDR, and Francis Shapiro developed it. It's called eye movement desensitization. And so basically what it's doing is it's a therapy process and you have to be trained in it, but it's basically this similar thing of, so the place where there's the wound, and then with your kind of supported memory networks get updated at the same time. It's integrating the left and the right brains, the hemispheres. But a cool small takeaway is basically anything that stimulates bilateral stimulation. So there's the butterfly hug, which is just me kind of tapping my left and right arms, or you can even tap your thighs. That's bilateral stimulation, which is really comforting, really soothing for our brains. And so that sometimes if I'm overwhelmed, if I'm stressed, I'll just go like that, just to kind of give myself that comfort, that love, and help my brain kind of bring both sides, what we'd call online, the left and right brain. But I think that that's definitely a part of part 5 and talking about kind of working with trauma. But yes, but a lot of therapists are trained in it, and it's a very specific protocol.
Very cool stuff. When I think of taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, I think of the book of Galatians. I think of how Peter had to be rebuked by Paul because Peter forgot the implications of the gospel.
Hmm.
He started wanting to say that Peter did, if you want to be at our table, you have to get circumcised under the strictures of the old covenant law. And Paul had to come along and say, Peter, you're forgetting the gospel. So yeah,
Mhm.
2 steps forward, 1 step back, fits and starts sometimes.
Definitely. Yeah.
Y'all, that's the same with physical healing also.
Yeah.
Well, actually, we're actually talking about physical healing.
Yeah. And that's, I don't know if y'all for future, but Dr. Gabor Mate, he's a physician, but has really studied impact of trauma on our physical health, and how when we don't process it, it turns to disease.
Yep. Very, very good stuff, y'all. One of the things, and I was not here this last Thursday, but what I really like, Caroline, I'm so grateful to you, is that, you know, I think that we're beginning to glimpse, or at least I am. I feel that I'm together with y'all beginning to glimpse some ways in which this topic of trauma and healing really is connected to the Christian life. It really is connected to the scriptures that we have. It really is connected to what we're doing together as the body of Christ together. I think that tonight, with Caroline's help, we've started to glimpse that, at least I have. And I think we're going to sort of take a deep dive into that next Thursday with my dear, dear friend, Nathan Jennings, who's going to close us out. Nathan, so keep coming back. But y'all, it is wonderful to be with Caroline, to be with everyone online, and to be with y'all in this room. Let's give it up one more time for our new friend.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to be with each of you. And Matt, thanks for inviting me to be part of this.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being my new friend.
Absolutely.
And we will talk soon.
Okay, take
Good
care,
night.
everyone. Good night. Peace be with
Bye.
you. Bye.
All right. Y'all, so